Colin, thanks so much for joining me on the Ambitious Minds podcast today. How's it feel being the guest?
Yeah, it's really enjoyable. I really like guest appearances, particularly when the show aligns with the interest that I've got. And when I think back to you and I exchanging DMs on LinkedIn when you were first starting out, I think you 40 odd episodes in now are in such a great spot. So I'm delighted to be here and get a chance to chat.
Yeah, and also I'm going to sort of pay you some gratitude for that as well, because you didn't need to respond to that random DM. But I'm actually going to give the listeners a bit of an insight into what your podcast is about, first of all, because I've been a huge fan of modern wisdom for a very long time. And I came across your podcast, which is about sort of productivity and self-development. And then I went back to the beginning and I saw that you had Chris Williamson on as number one. And I thought that was like just an amazing place to start. Have you actually been a fan of his for a while?
I would have been one of Chris's early listeners, like 2018 time. Probably in the first year or so of Modern Wisdom. I probably got acquainted to him through the Propane Fitness guys, Johnny Watson and Yusuf Smith, or Dr. Yusuf Smith. And I was an early listener. I had found podcasts through my football team Rangers, and then through trying to level up my sales ability in my day job, I was listening to mostly American podcasters back then. And then I found Modern Wisdom, which was my first kind of self-development podcast, alongside a guy called Jamie Alderton, who was known back then as Grenade J. He had a podcast called Mindset with Muscle. So I had these different podcasts that served different areas of my life, and Modern Wisdom was that kind of early one where I could relate to this fairly young guy at the time in the UK that was talking about elective sobriety, productivity. He was in great shape, which again helped me resonate and connect with him as well. And yeah, a really early listener. And then when I came to launch my show in lockdown 2020, Chris was my first guest. I had 6 banked. Him and I had gone back and forth on DM a few times because I was one of those early listeners, and the show was big in 2020, but nowhere near what it is, of course, now. I was probably one of those engaged listeners that would share it to my Instagram story, tag him, give him feedback on guests I particularly enjoyed, in the same way that at the stage my show is at just now, I try and be as responsive as possible to people that support it, find out what they like about it, ask them to share it and rate it, all that sort of good stuff. I messaged to Chris to say that I'm in a position now where I'm going to launch my own show. You've been a big inspiration for that. Of course, I'm not going to become the Aldi or the BTEC version of you, but I really respect what you've built. Would you be happy to be my first guest? And he was very much, look, mate, I've really valued what you've gone back and forth with me over the years on. Happy to help out. We're all locked inside anyway. This was March 2020 we recorded. Wow. Like at the very peak of the restrictions. So we booked a 2-hour slot on a Monday evening in the middle of lockdown, and we had about an hour and a half chat, and it went out on my podcast as episode 1, and I think it was a great start point. I think he is a brilliant role model for young men, and it was an amazing way to kick things off.
Yeah, he was also an inspiration for me starting this with his just do the thing is what he always says, and that really was a bit of a catalyst for me, being like, look, it's time to finally do something. But I do want to focus on this topic because your podcast is focused around this, and it's something that we were having an exchange with this morning, because you messaged me about the plan for the day, and I got the impression that you're very big on routines or like discipline. And how much have you always been interested in like productivity and that sort of thing?
I think it's grown over time to the extent I would have a level of mastery over it now, although that's not always perfect. There's a level of high performance that comes as a minimum for me. Like my lowest possible output day is probably a good day for a lot of people. Whereas my highest output day, maybe I'm not competing with the absolute best performers, but I'm competing at a level that I'm happy with and an output that I'm pleased with. A lot of my interest in performing well outside of my physical fitness actually came from my initial interest in physical fitness. I believe not bodybuilding, but strength training and sculpting and grooving your physique is a gateway drug to self-development in a lot of other areas, because it gives you an element of, if I can create mastery of how I train, how I eat, how I sleep, and those are probably the 3 key variables, look at the output that I'm generating in terms of how I look and how I feel and how people regard me and how I carry myself. I was like, wow, well, if I can do it in this particular domain, and this was probably 2nd or 3rd year at university after I'd stopped playing rugby, it really gave me an intuition that I should apply this in my studying. I should apply this in any jobs that I do during the summer period between terms. And since then, it's been something that I've not been obsessed with, but I've been very passionate about. Can I get the most out of the hours or the effort that I put into things, as long as the things that I'm putting my time and effort into are things that align with my values and course. And these are words that are coming to the fore now in 2024, but I probably couldn't articulate it 2021, but I'm definitely more able to understand how I'm wired now.
And because what I find really impressive about what you're doing, because I look at what I'm doing and I've got a full-time job and I'm trying to do a podcast on the side, and you're doing that too. And you actually, I think, release more episodes per week than I do. So I'm quite keen to get into this and understand what does your week look like? You're obviously a very high functioning person, but that has that come over time where you've had to be very disciplined and build those things into your weeks?
It's definitely come over time. I think we all have more time than we give ourselves credit for at times as well, because there's always that dead time, and there's a place for that 100%. There is a place for scrolling TikTok. There is a place for checking out Instagram. There is a place for watching Netflix. But doing it on your terms and doing it consciously is one of the most important things, and not necessarily filling time when you committed to do something else and doing it with something that's not quote unquote productive or not quote unquote working towards the thing that you said you cared about. The thing you mentioned was the little Chris Williamsonism. That's really cool now that he's got those Chris Williamsonisms that we're all quoting. It shows how far he's come. I think things have definitely been built into my routine and my habits and my lifestyle over time. And a lot of that comes from diary management, a concept called time boxing or time blocking, which is made popular by Nia Rial, who's the author of a book called Indistractable. Somebody I was lucky to interview in the podcast a long time ago now, 2021. I really believe that when you block out your diary with the things that you plan on doing when you plan on doing them, there's like a commitment that you make to yourself. And I'm a disciple of James Clear. He's probably one of my goal guests on the podcast to have on. I had Nia Rial, who was a goal guest, and James Clear would be like another Pokemon I want to catch. And he is very big on your habits being in alignment with your identity. And my identity is as a 7-figure sales director. It is as a podcast host of a top 1%, whatever wanky term you want to use, podcast. It is as somebody who looks after their mind and their body. It's as somebody that shows up for their family and their friends. So best believe when I strip that back, the things that fill up my 6 a.m. till 9 p.m. when I'm awake, they need to be in alignment with those different identities that I hold. So the habits need to reinforce that, whether it's my morning walk, which means that I'm listening to a podcast and setting myself up for the day, but I'm getting movement to look after my mind and my body, whether it's the sales calls that I put in between 1:30 and 4:30, and I know that I need to do those in order to hit my targets or hit my KPIs. And then it's the training session that I've got in at lunchtime, where I've got an hour and 10 minutes to drive from the flat to David Lloyd, get my session in, drive back, get showered and get ready to go again. All the things that are booked in there are things that I know are in alignment with the things that I've told myself I want to do. And best believe when the calendar reminder comes up, or I look down at the written diary, and I've brought a copy with it me today, I need to do them when the trigger comes, and then make sure that I do them to the best of my ability when the time's been assigned to them.
Yeah, it's really interesting listening to that. And there was a guest on recently that I had called Dan Lipman, and he has a young family, and he speaks about a similar thing, but he says that when you have a young family, you have no option but to be this disciplined, because the kids aren't going to wait for you, and so if you want to fit in the gym session, if you want to fit in something in the morning, you have to get up early to do it. You have to find ways to do it. And I find it very inspiring to hear that, actually, because it's something that I'm starting to learn over time, and more, and I have to become more disciplined as I'm doing the podcast. But can we just focus on your job for a moment as well, because it's the podcast being called Ambitious Minds, you have a podcast, but you also have a very successful job too. So let's go back to that as well.
That's right. I've worked in sales since finishing university. I did a master's in politics at the University of Glasgow, graduated in 2014. So despite the boyish looks, I'm 32 and have been working in sales for over a decade. Initially, that was in the insurance industry, but in the last 3 years, it's been in the design-led furniture industry and the supply, install, of furniture. My sector in particular is student accommodation, so I know really well the universities, what's called PBSA, purpose-built student accommodation, and an element of the HMO, institutional investors in student housing. And I really liked sales from a young age, and I felt I had a relative flair for it because I wasn't absolutely terrified of rejection. I don't like rejection, nobody does, but I can face it. I feel I can communicate well, and I feel that I can adapt to who I'm communicating with. All skills, by the way, which are transferable to podcasting, as you well know, Jay. So there was an element of kind of feeding two things in terms of how much I've progressed in both those fields. But in the last 3 years, moved from insurance into furniture, mostly because I felt I was banging my head against a brick wall. I'd worked my way up to the world's biggest insurance broker, Marsh and McClellan. Many people have be aware of those, particularly your maybe London-based listeners. And I was on what was called their sales academy and fast track to director scheme, but the fast track was not very fast. And I was number 4 or the 4th person brought in within the business development team in Scotland. And with that, I was the most junior in terms of the prospects I was given to get a chance to look at. So either it was the smallest ones or the ones that the 3 guys more senior to me had a chance to prospect and probe around and thought, nah, fuck it, we'll pass it down the pile. So I was doing quite well in terms of getting the meetings, and I was following the process, and the training I got there was second to none. Like, I still rely heavily on a lot of the things that I learned, the behaviours and the habits that I got from there, and maybe some of the methodologies in terms of my outreach on LinkedIn or email and presentations. And I was doing a lot of ingenuitive stuff as well. I was recording videos to send to finance directors, talking through what I knew about their company, what I knew about their industry, what I thought the insurance risks were, what I thought was going to happen within the insurance market in terms of premiums. And then the kind of hook would be, it'd be great to have a conversation with you, your managing director, and whoever else is involved in the insurance procurement ahead of your renewal next year. I'll bring to the table, and then I would name whatever subject matter expert within Marsh, because Marsh, you had a lot of resource to pull. And I was getting meetings this way. So a lot of the senior guys at Marsh were like, this guy's really good, he's doing really well. But it was so slow because I was still working on the prospects that maybe had less chance of winning. So my first boss, when I was 21 in the insurance industry, had moved into the furniture industry in 2017, and he kept trying to bring me across. And I kept saying, no. It wasn't a regulated profession. You didn't turn up in a blue suit with your with your black shoes because there was no brown in town. And I kept resisting until I started to find out that the guys that had gone to work for him were getting as much in commission and bonus as their salary. And I couldn't see how that could happen in the insurance industry the way things were going for me. I would quite often get discretionary bonuses based on behaviour, but I'd be missing my target because, and not a bad marketer blames his tools, but I just didn't have the means to go and achieve the numbers that I wanted to. So eventually I moved across, and the last 3 years have been phenomenal. There's a phrase that some of the guests on the podcast have used, a guy called Adam Power. He spoke about right entrepreneur, wrong vehicle. I'm a big believer in right salesperson, wrong vehicle. Yeah. So by moving into furniture where the order value was higher, the profitability was higher, guys were doing 500, 600, 700, 800, 900 millions of pounds worth of sales. So of course you can get paid a good salary from that. So I was like, okay, I just need to be in this pond and go swimming in there and catch some bigger fish. So moved across, applying the same behaviour, same skill sets. Things started to happen really quickly. In my first year, did about 300 grand worth of sales from a standing start, which was great. That grew to 800, grew to 1.1 million last year. And then this year we're on 1.7 million. And I've got another good few months until April to keep pushing that. So that was an interesting lesson for me, and it's something I've spoken about in my own podcast a lot. Sometimes you may have the right capabilities and skill set, but you may be applying it in the wrong space, and that's a hard thing to do. Particularly, I mentioned I had a resistance to going into furniture because insurance was this regulated, respected profession. My parents were really proud. They're like, oh, you go down to the city and you go to the Marsh & McClellan office at Tower Place, and when you go to meetings in Scotland with whatever £1 million business you go and see, you go in a suit and tie, whereas in furniture I'm often a polo shirt or a quarter zip and chinos, and I go to a big building site that's being fitted out, or I go to a university that's replacing 400 mattresses. It's not as glamorous, but best believe I'm fiscally far better rewarded, and from a purpose and energy perspective, feel so much happier about what I'm involved in and what I'm tangibly working towards, Jay.
Is that because you can see the value of your output in the...
That's the beauty of sales in general, though. many people will, you maybe know this, on my podcast I do a solo episode every 10 episodes. A lot of the questions are about feeling a bit lost in their career. How do I find more purpose? And if it's a really young guy who maybe hasn't invested a lot of time in a particular profession or industry, I'll quite often encourage them to go and work in a sales role, because you can literally see, I made this number of calls, had this number of meetings, did this number of presentations, did this number of quotes, got this number of deals. That's great for people who are just desperately being like, okay, if I put this amount in the top of the funnel, what comes out the bottom? Whereas maybe some operational roles or some management roles it's a little bit more difficult to do that. And good companies will paint that out for you and help you understand what role you play as a cog in the machine. But if you're a young guy and you're a little bit lost, I quite often do encourage them to go and sell something.
Yeah. I want to go back to the university part, because what did you study, first of all? But I want to go back even further than that. When you were growing up, what did you want to be when you were older?
Yeah, I studied, and this is why I studied it, I studied politics at the University of Glasgow, and that was driven by my desire as a child to be a journalist, in particular a sports journalist. So I wanted to write mostly in the rugby space, but I would have written in football as well. I was a massive Rangers fan. That would have been a big area of passion. And when I was probably 15 or 16, I'd be writing the match reports for the men's team for the rugby club that I played at, West of Scotland. And I'd be travelling around, and West played in what was called Premier 1 at that point, which was the top amateur league in the country. And there would always be a press box at the stadium. And I would write in the one at home, of course, but then I would travel to Boroughmuir or Melrose or wherever the team were going, and there would be journalists in the box with me, and I'd ask them like, oh, what did you do? And a lot of these guys weren't operating at a high level because they were writing a match report for an amateur rugby game for the Glasgow Herald or whatever national newspaper. But one of the games, it was a top of the table clash with Glasgow Hawks, and the guy from the Scotsman was there, and I knew he wrote articles about the Scottish rugby team and the Glasgow Warriors rugby team and the Edinburgh Gunners rugby team. So I was like, okay, this guy actually does know what he's talking about. And he said, don't go and do a journalism degree, because they're spitting out however many graduates a year from Strathclyde University to do that. Go and do a heavily written based degree, like a history, a philosophy, a politics, economic and social history. Take your pick of the social sciences, and then on the side do your writing. And I was really glad I did that. And I'd always had an interest in politics, and hopefully we won't get too political in this show, Jay, but maybe we will. I went and did politics at the University of Glasgow, and it was heavily written based. It was heavily focused on taking large amounts of information, distilling it down into understandable arguments and presenting your case. There was a lot of presenting, there was a lot of talking. So all things that I didn't initially take to like a duck to water, but started to grow into as I became more confident in myself, in particular, maybe more confident in my body and how I held myself too in terms of my weight training at the time, definitely helped. And I would say, I started university in September 2010, and 4 or 5 months in, the biggest newspaper in Glasgow, the Glasgow Herald, announced redundancies of like 80% of their staff, and they were just going to freelancers. Because nowadays, who buys a newspaper? Nowadays, they have people submitting articles to their website, and maybe there's a paywall, or maybe there's a donate button like The Guardian or something like that. Not that I read The Guardian. And at that point, I realised there's not actually that clear a career path to be a journalist. It's not the traditional path of like, you'd work your way up as a T-boy and do that. So I kind of fell away from that, and it took me a long time to come back to journalistic pursuits. But I think I've done that through podcasting, because I think the modern day journalist or commentator, as shown by the last US election and Trump winning and all the podcasts he did, a modern day journalist is a podcaster. I go to podcasts all the time now for opinion and insight, and I love interviewing people. And that was what I liked doing when outside the match reports. I would do interviews with the players and understand, like, how did you think that went, and talk to the coach. And nowadays I get to do that on a weekly basis. So it is funny. I'm glad you brought me back to that, Jay. So it's a cool story to talk about.
It's really interesting because we are recording this just after the presidential election. And I saw a statistic today where Kamala Harris did 5 podcast episodes. And I think she got something like 5 million views in total. Donald Trump did 15 podcasts and he got 124 million views in total. And it just shows you there the power of growing. First of all, you know, Kamala Harris should have gone on to Rogan to be able to put her side of the story across. She didn't. I don't know why, but Donald Trump went on there and got 45 million views. That potentially swung the election. And exactly as you're saying there, the power now of podcasting is where people get their news from, people get their advice from. You know, people like you and I have done a lot of our self-development on podcasts over the years, and it's becoming a much more critical role in people's lives now, I think, podcasting, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to start this. And I think that we maybe have quite similar audiences, which are young people that want more. They just want to progress. They want to grow incrementally over time. And I actually want to go back and ask you a question about the university part, because I think it ties in quite nicely to this. There is going to be a subsection of listeners who are considering going to university. Are you glad that you went to university, or do you have any regrets about it?
University in Scotland is a little bit different because we have our fees paid through a thing called SAS, so you don't get into as much debt. There's also a big focus if you do get into the university you want. So I got into Russell Group Institution, University of Glasgow. I lived at home for university, so I didn't really take on the same level of debt if I was down here and I applied for University of Birmingham or Manchester and I got in there and I went and lived in halls and I was paying $9,000 a year for my politics degree. I might feel differently, but I definitely learned a lot. I didn't grow up as much as if you move away from home for the first time, because you live away from home in terms of that regard, albeit you do party a lot of the time as well. I did break a lot of ground with my parents in terms of I was going out a lot later and I was coming back late, and they were very supportive of that. But I do think there's a big difference between going and living away in halls to commuting in and out of university. I also went to university at 17. It's quite common again in Scotland to do that if you get the grades and you want to go. So there's an element of, I was so young. So I graduated with my MA at 21. I just took 3 or 4 years to grow up. So there was a value in that, and I definitely learnt a lot in that time. But could it have been condensed down into a 3-year degree? Absolutely. Could it have been more utilised in terms of the time that I had? I think in my final year, my actual, what you would call contact time, was 4 hours a week. Two 2-hour seminars with the lecturers and the different cohort that I was in those courses with, to discuss the reading that we'd done. Now, there was a lot of reading to do, so you could turn up and actually contribute to those. But think about what I could have done in that time. If I was wired the way I am now, I would have built a massive podcast in those other hours that I had available to me. So university, I'm not somebody that is super against it, and I'm not somebody that's super for it. I think I learned valuable skills during that time. I think I grew up a hell of a lot. But I think you see a lot of people do those kind of vocational degrees where they work 3 weeks of the month and they go and study 1 week of the month. That for me would have been incredible, because you grow up so much when you go into the workplace as well. You kind of socialize and you understand how to conduct yourself. You understand how to format an email, or how to structure your slides in a presentation. Whereas university was very academic, theory, great for presenting to your cohort, and great for writing fluently, albeit nowadays that's maybe being stripped away by AI and people using tools like that. It was a valuable time for me, but I definitely don't think I made the most of it by any shape or form.
It's funny as well, because I'm going to guess that you didn't need the degree to do the job that you're in now, but likewise, you gave yourself the opportunity to grow up, and then probably figured out along that journey that what you wanted to do, which led you into Marshall McLennan, which then led you into the sales role, understanding that you were good at sales. What do you think there? Do you think you've got a particular differentiator when it comes to sales? Because you said something earlier on, which I wrote down, about you did videos and you were sending videos. Was that common, or was that something that you were doing?
No, it was really rare. A few people were doing it because we got into the lockdown period. I will caveat, I'd started creating content online long before my podcast. I started a mostly fitness, and I would probably say a mindset Instagram page with my brother at the time. Back in 2017, it was called CamBros. That's actually where CamBro comes from.
Ah, okay.
It was Campbell Brothers. And we grew that to about 8,000 or 9,000 followers within the first year on Instagram. And then my brother dropped away and didn't fancy it. But by that time we had an audience, so we dropped it from CamBros to CamBro. Campbell Brother, just kept it singular. So I'd had practice at speaking to camera through that. So by the time 2020 rolled around, I was quite confident to speak down the camera lens to a finance director, to a managing director. So the kind of lockdown period where things went to video conferencing and went to more digital stuff was actually a bit of a competitive advantage for me. I think in terms of sales itself, I mentioned that I'm not massively afraid of rejection, albeit I don't relish it. I think I'm very good at following a process and refining the quality of the input over time. People always talk about, oh, what's more important, quality or quantity? A lot of the time, quality will come after you've done enough quantity to actually improve and iterate. So, for example, if I said to you, to get to be a top 1% podcast on listen notes, like my show's managed to get to over the last 18 months, do 100 episodes. And people are like, oh, that sounds like an awful lot. Be like, by 100 episodes, you've done over 100 hours of recording, typically in a normal interview format. You're going to be a lot slicker than most other podcasts. So there's a good chance for you to be in that top 1%. And I definitely think I had a little bit of a natural flair for sales, but I also took really well to feedback on how I could improve the quantity of my output and make it of a higher quality as well.
Yeah, feedback's a tricky one these days, I think. And I was chatting to a guy that was on the podcast. It's not been released yet, but he's he was saying that he's given up giving feedback to his staff. He's a CEO and he's given up giving feedback unless he really trusts the person. And that being because it's just got him into trouble sometimes. He gives some feedback which he thinks is constructive and people get offended by it. What do you think about that?
I think taking advice from the right people is an absolute game changer. One of the roundtable style episodes we do on the podcast, maybe every 20 or 30, is with my friend Chris Burns and David Hatt. And one of the themes we did would have been the start of 2024 was called Stand on the Shoulders of Giants. Yeah. So I'm a big believer that we can stand on the shoulders of giants from an advice and an insight perspective, whether that's online mentors or in work. I've been massively relying on mentor figures who were a few years further down the line than me in their sales career, and I've been able to maybe take a particular way that they handle a difficult conversation, or they deliver a price increase, or they deliver the bad news, or how they celebrate a win, or how they use the momentum from that new contract to use the social proof and testimonial to go and win the next one. You're borrowing all the time from people who are further ahead than you. So I think to not take feedback is a really tremendous mistake, and it's going to limit your ability to do well. Equally, and it's not sexy to caveat things, is it? It's much more sexy if I just said you should always be able to take feedback. You want to take feedback from people who have your best interests at heart, who have a proven track record or some measure and standing in the area that they're giving you feedback. For example, I will always take listener feedback to the podcast about how I've conducted myself, how I've held it. If there's somebody who's listened to one episode and they're like, you're shit, mate, it's not really going to be valuable. But if it's somebody that's listened to a good few episodes of the podcast and they'll be like, oh, Colin, I actually thought you were a bit quiet on that episode, or I thought you were a bit interruptive in that episode, or I didn't particularly like that guest, I'm open to it. And because they've got some sort of skin in the game. In the same way, if you come to me as a fat personal trainer, we're not gonna have a conversation that's gonna be very valuable. A broke financial advisor or somebody who's in terrible debt, you're not gonna take them particularly seriously. So there's an element of feedback must come from somebody who commands a level of respect that feedback is warranted and is going to be of some sort of merit.
I've written this down whilst we were talking. I think I've also taken this from Chris Williamson, but don't take criticism from people that you wouldn't take advice from. And I think that that's so powerful, because you then start to compartmentalize who are the people that you trust, their opinion all rounded, and who are the people that are just the, I know, in inverted commas, the haters. On that topic, if you've got overwhelmingly positive reviews on your podcast. I looked at it earlier on, I think over 500 5-star reviews, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's,
we're flying.
Yeah, you're absolutely flying. But do you get like random messages from people, or like bits of hate?
TikTok's the only one that's
really
wild.
Interesting.
This week in particular, we're speaking at a funny time. We just did a clip from that roundtable style episode I was telling you about, and people were going bananas on there. I think it's a low IQ app though, and people are a lot of the time they're anonymous on there, so they're a little bit emboldened. In terms of like criticism, yeah, maybe some people don't like to maybe hear about personal responsibility or about finance, or about, for example, if we talk about a lot of the time with mental health, the mind follows the body. So what have you been doing recently in terms of your habits and your routines that could maybe help you feel better? And that can be really triggering for somebody who maybe is in that sort of hopeless cycle and they feel like they can't do anything about it, and they're thinking, this right-wing podcast bro is telling me to go for a walk in the morning and to eat whole foods rather than processed food, and to drink less alcohol and not smoke weed. Who the hell is he to say this? So there's a visceral reaction to that sort of advice, and I understand that. I also know that the vast majority of people who are going to like get angry and lash out about stuff they see on the internet are probably not the kind of people that are going to come across and listen to a 60-90 minute podcast that is giving advice from the best intentioned place possible that just wants everyone else to win.
Yeah. As somebody that does value their self-development, is there one change that you've made to your life that's had an oversized ROI?
It's really hard to pick one. I would say in general, having control over my diary and adhering to the type of person that I said I was going to be. So if I set those standards of 7-figure sales director, top 1% podcast host, strong, supportive friend, somebody who's physically and mentally well and looked after, then I need to live up to it. So having this like ideal self and trying to make sure that it's not a delusional aspiration and making sure that I live in alignment with that, that's probably the core fundamental reason that I show up as who I am on a regular basis. And that definitely links into the whole personal responsibility, extreme ownership side of things. So anything that does unfold is largely my fault, but also my congratulations. Like, well done, you've been able to do that. So feeling that level of accountability for your inputs and your outcomes is probably what underpins a lot of how I show up on a regular basis. And I think that would be like a philosophy, so to speak, that I try to live by as much as possible.
So does that come down more then to like discipline, or like that you've brought into your life?
Discipline, how you see yourself, how you show up for yourself, how you match that level of vision and idealism about yourself with your actual behaviors. I mentioned the word delusion there. You have a lot of people that will say, oh, well, I really want to achieve this in my day job, or I want to own this business, and then none of their actions align with that. Everyone's New Year's resolution, I want to drop a dress size, or I want to improve how I feel physically about myself. And then if they're not training and eating in alignment with that, then it is just a delusional aspiration at that point in time. And that's a hard message for a lot of people to hear. But I'm a big believer that if you can line up how you see yourself with how you behave, you will be a lot happier on the whole, and you'll feel a lot more fulfilled from how you're spending your time, because you can see over time, whether it's a financial metric, a physical metric, an emotional metric, a spiritual metric, if that's something you're so inclined to talk about, you will see over time moving in the right direction towards that if the behaviors you've picked are ones that are conducive towards reaching that goal.
Yeah, and I think what you've said there is really important, particularly in today's world with social media, that you know and are very comfortable with you and your values, and you are a principle-driven person. Whereas a lot of people these days would see images on social media and say, that's the person I want to be. Was there something that you did? Were there steps that you took to really understand and nail down what your values were?
I'm not perfect at this. I definitely would say my upbringing from my mum and dad was tremendous. Mum stopped working after my brother was born. My brother's younger by about 2.5 years. So we were really well raised by mum in that regard, in terms of how we should behave towards other people, how we should behave in terms of our value and our alignments. And dad set a tremendous example as the provider and the masculine force within the household. And I'm a big believer in that, and I've really put a lot of stock in that. In terms of really understanding what my values were and how I see myself, it's that whole you are what you consume piece. So consuming content from people that I look up to, reading books of people that I admire, whether that's figures from history or whether that's fictional books with heroes and characters that you can aim at as well and aspire to be as well. I think that's tremendously important. And having things to aim towards, but also things to aim away from. As humans, we have a massive negativity bias, don't we? And I think you and I were speaking about Dan Meredith potentially previously, who's been a guest on my show. If not you, Jay, I definitely spoke to somebody about his message, and he was talking about writing down a negativity list of traits and behaviors, or even like how you want to spend your time, and that gives you something to aim away from. The whole like anti-hero piece is really good. So for example, I might say that you mentioned Chris Williamson, or I used to watch a lot of a guy called Joe Delaney on YouTube back in the day, and I really liked and admired these two gentlemen. But you could also look at people maybe in your local area or your local town or your local city and think, oh, he's like a few years ahead of me in school or university, or he's in this career that I'm in, but I don't like how he behaves on the weekend, or I don't like how he physically looks, or I don't like his relationship with his wife or his children. I don't want to be like that, but I like some of his other traits. So you can pick and choose things that you admire, but also have things that you want to aim away from that you think, I categorically don't want that, so I best not follow that exact same path.
Interesting. So you're almost like building the perfect version based on very good characteristics that you're seeing in different people, and obviously something that comes. I can resonate with what you said there about the upbringing. Like, just taught core values of just being polite and being kind and being conscientious and all these things which maybe we take for granted these days because not everybody behaves in the same way. But yeah, I think that my growing up, my childhood was just so fundamental in that to build the person who I am today.
Products for environment, G.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, but my environment, and I think as you were saying there as well, has become now external as well. So my environment usually would be the people, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. However, I think that now you're the average of the 5 people you consume the most. And I think that's been fundamental as well in my development over time. And do you also recognize that you're playing that role in other people now?
There's a responsibility as a content creator with a particular level of audience to understand what you're putting out there can have an influence. It's not going to be the influence on somebody's life, but it's going to play a role. If they listen to my show for an hour a week for the last 4.5 years, they're going to definitely be shaped in some way by some of the ideas spoken about, or some of the suggestions, or some of the advice, or just some of the energy that's been transmitted through listening to that. So it's not a responsibility that I bear lightly. I'm really proud of the platform that I've built so far, and I hope it continues to grow and have a positive impact. But there's a phrase that comes up quite a lot on probably self-development podcasts like this one: a rising tide raises all ships. So if I can be a positive rising tide and force, and somebody listening to me for maybe the half hour on the way to the job that they're not particularly pleased in, and the half hour on the way home on a Monday morning and Monday afternoon, and that sets them up to maybe consider what they might want to align their skills with, or what they might want to turn their attention to, then goodness me, it's cool when you get that message on a random November morning and somebody says, Colin, been listening to the podcast for the last year and I've done this. That comes through sometimes, and I just screenshot it and keep it in my camera roll, and I think that's really, really powerful and really, really cool. And those messages make my day. And equally, a lot of the time that comes from somebody who's never been in touch ever, and then they pop up and they say they've been listening, particularly on LinkedIn, because I think there's a lot of people that work on there. They maybe see your clips and they see your shorts and they see your promotional image, and they're tuning in and listening, but you're not getting the feedback or the likes or the comments until one day they come out the blue and they say, I really enjoy what you're putting out there. Actually, I just listened to your episode with whoever it is and I got this from it. And I'm thinking, wow, numbers on the screen don't tell that story. If it, like the last podcast has done another 1,000 downloads in the episode before, and you're thinking, oh, that's really good. But those 1,000 are all real people that have been moved in some way. So that, yeah, it's a cool position.
You've actually brought back memories of the day when I got my first Apple podcast review from somebody that I didn't know. So at first, friends and family were leaving reviews, and but the first random message that I got through, and I was like, oh my God, wow, that's someone out there that's listening has taken the time to leave a genuine review. And actually, it's so nice to go through those, and that's why I love Apple Podcasts over Spotify,
because it's written.
Yeah, and I think YouTube is also great for this too, because you start to build the community, and you start to see, what people leave comments more, and then you start to get a lot more positive feedback on there. And I love that. It's nice that you can see people are actively engaging and clearly taking in the sort of the learnings from the guests and from you. And on this topic of learning from guests, you've had so many on, so I don't expect you. I don't want to put you on the spot. But is there one guest that you've had on, or something that somebody said that sort of either changed your perspective or left like quite a lasting impression on you?
There's been so many, and sometimes I struggle to do this because I'm so in the podcast. There's a weekly Sunday episode that goes out, and I'm prepping for the next one, and I'm looking back to pick the clips for the last one, and you're kind of running all over the place. But for my 250th episode, it would be May 2024, I did 15 lessons from 250 podcasts, and that forced me to sit down and write some of them down. Equally, I've got a solo podcast coming up this week that I'll record when I get home from London tomorrow probably. And again, it's one of the similar questions. People are always asking, what's like an unusual lesson you had, or what's one you reflect on a lot? And And one that came to mind, and I wrote this quote down in preparation, was from a guy called Dr. Arya. I don't know if you've heard of Dr.
I
Arya,
listened
but
to the podcast. Yeah.
yeah, he's a fantastic guest, and it's something that I reflect back on. And this quote sits in my notes, but I printed it off for today. And he said, "I don't know any growth without suffering. We've been institutionalized in modern society that the delightful parts of life are good and the painful, destructive parts are bad. And it isn't the case, because they are both two different sides to the same coin. You can't have victory without challenges. You can't have courage without despair. You can't have joy without sorrows." That, for me, underlines the duality of life and the fact that, for example, I might be super excited to release this new podcast episode on Sunday with Andrew Craig, who we're both big fans of and both going to have on our podcast. But I might have emailed Rob Moore or Mike Thurston and got told, no, they're not coming on the podcast when I want to interview them. So there's the elation from this vehicle of podcasting. I've got this fantastic guest that's going to have a great impact on my audience. And then there's the sting of rejection about the guest that I've reached out to that I can't get. That is two sides of the same coin. You cannot have the rain without sun. So the elation you feel at one thing, you must understand that there should be disappointment on the other side of that, in the same way like it happens all the time in my sales career. Yeah. In fact, even now, with the level of execution and skill that I feel I've got in that space, for me to be sitting on whatever number I'm sitting on fiscally for this year in terms of my target, my pipeline was like 3 or 4x the size. So more than 66% of the people that I quoted have said no, or they've delayed the works and it's not happened. So there's so much that you need to understand, that all these great moments that you're enjoying experiencing, you only really get the joy and experience from them because you understand what it feels like to not have that experience, for it to actually be hard or tough or painful.
Yeah, and like you work in sales, and I think that primes you so well to face this rejection. And there have been moments. My job also, I guess, is sales. I'm having to. I say having to, but like we are trying to get clients to entrust us to invest their money for them, and it's a very, very big emotional thing. So yeah, of course we've faced rejection a number of times, but there have been moments when doing the podcast where I've experienced that imposter syndrome for sure. When it always comes on the back of a rejection or a knockback of some kind. Somebody cancelled on me the morning of, and that really set me back. And I was definitely not the best version of myself for about a week on the podcast. And I almost I don't know, I can't really, the best way to articulate it is probably to say that I was in a very negative mindset about the podcast and thinking, oh, do I want to do this? And that was that imposter syndrome setting in. But then you, as you say, then you get those wins, and then you get like a great guest coming on, and that's what it's all for. I think that the analogy would be like the surfer who goes out and he lives for the good wave, or you play golf, right? So
yeah.
You play for that one shot. It's because the rest of the round could be terrible, but you walk away remembering like that amazing shot that I played, etc.
Yeah, it is so true. And Dr. Arya was sharing that from a place of, at the time, publicly speaking about his wife being unfaithful and being pregnant with another man's baby, and him being able to leave that situation without anger and appreciate it for what it was, and understand that this too shall pass. We didn't speak about it publicly in the podcast. He's now spoken about it since then. But just a couple months before we recorded, his brother, Darius, who you may remember from Pop Idol, actually, that's his brother.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Darius
okay.
Dinesh,
Yeah.
They're brothers. Darius had passed away tragically, and that was off limits for the podcast discussion that we had, but he was sharing lessons that he was going through during that period, and we spoke about it in the car in and out of whether it would come up, and he said, let's not speak about it explicitly, but I am going to speak about this in public, and the lessons that we share from this are related to that. So that whole, probably the worst possible situation you can imagine in terms of losing your brother at a young age, or being cheated on by your wife and her leaving you, he was able to frame that as understanding that these things happen in life and it's not final. And I'm sat across the desk from this guy who's so stoic and calm about it and understands that it's all part of the ebb and flow of life, where I was thinking if I got that news, I'd want to burn the place to the ground. But when you're surrounded by people like that who give you these frameworks to create a gap between the stimulus and the response, the whole Viktor Frankl man search for meaning, like, largely things are how you interpret them rather than how they are, which sounds very difficult to comprehend, but you can listen back and understand what I'm saying there. that is so valuable to have somebody like that to speak to and to listen to. And I've had a lot of messages off the back of that podcast about how valuable somebody as spiritually and mentally aligned as him, to have him for an hour and a half and that episode be evergreen and out there for people to listen to is a real privilege.
And this just sort of goes back and pays kudos to the podcast again, because, you know, we doing this, you get to sit down with people that you can learn from all the time and you can look up to. And, you know, you can't just go into, if you just sent a message on LinkedIn, if you didn't have the podcast, and said to a successful entrepreneur or, you know, philosophist, and said, you know, can I get you an hour of your time? Can I come and meet you for an hour? And they say, like, they'll probably not respond. But they do on the podcast, that they come on and you learn so much from them and you listen to them and you take away those valuable lessons, and then you have the ability to share them to the rest of the world, which is an incredible, incredible tool. However, this being said, it's very easy for us to say, yeah, listen to a podcast and they give you the tools. It's much harder to put them into practice. Do you still get moments where you're nervous, for example, going into a podcast, or do you get moments where you do suffer from imposter syndrome yourself?
I don't get massively nervous. A lesson I learned pretty early on was from a sports psychologist called Hannah Huseman, who was mental performance coach at the Texas Rangers. And she explained that nervousness and excitement are the same hormones within the body. And renaming that feeling and saying that I'm not nervous, I'm excited. I'm not nervous, I'm not going to fumble or blank. In fact, I'm going to feel more nimble and agile and quicker on my feet and more up and accelerated. That was a great way to reframe things. I'm also a big believer, and I think this might be a Hermosiism, 20 minutes of preparation can alleviate 80-90% of your nerves. I do a lot more than 20 minutes of preparation for a podcast. So I turn up pretty well versed in terms of how it's going to go, and I think 280 odd episodes in, I'm in a good spot to be able to turn up and feel great. In terms of imposter syndrome, I hosted a guy called Sahil Bloom, who is a huge
on Twitter,
Twitter account, massive email list, somebody that I thought was incredibly wise. He has a lot of he terms razors that I really, really like the concept of. And I was excited, but I was nervous before opening that StreamYard to go on with this guy who's based in New York, who's agreed to do my podcast. I had so much prep that I felt ready. And I think there's elements of me maybe sounding more rushed in my conversation with him. That was November 2022. So I think I've developed since then. I also hosted Daniel Priestley, who you mentioned. That post that you were talking about in terms of comparing Kamala Harris's podcast experience with Trump was actually from Daniel, and we've got on really well since then. I was in Dubai at the same time as him last December, and we got that booked. I wasn't nervous before it, but I was aware of how many ears and eyes were probably going to end up on that episode compared to my most average episode that I released in terms of guest size and profile. So there was an element of expectation on that. But again, I went on the preparation I'd done. I went on the fact that I think I'm a good conversationalist, and I was confident that I'm ready for this. And I'm not huge on words of affirmation, but I do journal. I was journaling that morning to say, I'm well prepared, I'm ready, I'm somebody that's done the work that deserves this opportunity. Daniel Priestley is an expert. I will ask the questions that will enable him to platform and share his expertise in the best possible light. Those were all things that I was thinking about and talking to myself beforehand, and I had my routine. I slept as well as I could. I'd gone for a morning walk in sunlight, which is easy in Dubai. I'd had my caffeine. I had my notes ready in front of me. We had a beautiful studio to shoot it in. We sat down. We had a good conversation. So I kind of banished the imposter syndrome, and I banished the nerves as much as I could physically control.
I can resonate with what you were saying there about the preparation, because now I wasn't, I feel like I'm doing so much, and I'm really sort of struggling to do my job and the podcast and send sort of questions in advance to the guest, etc. But that really helps you to be prepared. So for example, a few days ago, I sent you some questions, and that allowed me, because I had a terrible night's sleep last night. I sometimes get allergic reactions or intolerances to things, and it causes a terrible night's sleep. It's like hay fever, and I'm not too sure what it was, but at 6 o'clock in the morning I woke up and I was puffy and I was itchy, and I realized that I hadn't had a good night's sleep, and that has not put me in the best possible position to be able to execute a podcast as I would like. However, if I'd have woken up that day unprepared, it could be an absolute car crash of a day. I'd be stressed. I would be nervous. I would be suffering from imposter syndrome. However, being prepared a couple of days in advance takes away 50% of the concern. All I have to focus on now is how do I get myself in the best position sort of mentally to be in that podcast, and popping some antihistamines, for example. And I actually drank a Trip. Do you drink the CBD
I've heard of them, yeah, CBD drink, yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, well, just going to pop one of these because, it's supposed to have more of a calming influence.
Anti-inflammatory, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I did that. But had I have woken up this morning and thought, oh my God, I now need to start preparing for this interview, or I would normally go into an interview and I'd freestyle it, for example, I'm not too sure I could have done that. I really don't.
Yeah, it's understanding how you're wired personally as well, because there'll be some people that could jump onto a podcast or jump onto a work presentation and just absolutely freewheel it and skate by with the skin of their pants. But then the vast majority of people, I think, would benefit from that little bit of time beforehand, doing the reps, doing the practice, feeling like they're going to turn up and do well. And that's applicable whether you host a podcast or whether you're somebody that wants to perform well in a job interview or wants to do that new pitch to investors, or whatever format you're in. You want to give yourself the best possible chance of performance. And I've been coaching a number of young sales guys the last probably 6-7 months, and I always encourage them to do role play, and you should see their face the first few times you encourage that. And I'll always say to them, would you rather flop on the phone to a prospect or fumble your words with me? And they're like, fumble words with you. And I was like, because do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to listen and be like, have you thought about saying this instead? Whereas the prospect's going to hang up on you, or they're going to say, don't call me back, or they're going to be like, okay, no, not just now. That could still happen, but you reduce the chances of that happening by doing some practice with me or your colleague or your spouse or whoever's going to be willing to listen to you. So I'm a big believer in, if you can do things away from the battleground in training, you're going to be a lot more reassured when it comes to go time, or at least give yourself the best possible chance of being.
Yeah, 100%. And we, through work, also have had these, and they are really cringy, don't get me wrong. Somebody comes in, you do training, you do presentation skills, and often you're doing it to your colleagues, you're doing it to somebody, and nobody goes into that saying, I want to do this today. However, everybody leaves that glad that they did it.
Glad.
You have to put yourself outside your comfort zone in order to make progression. And I think that's, you mentioned earlier on, I think, about discomforts and comforts, and you have to be comfortable with discomfort in order to make any progress. Otherwise, you'll just always stay within your box and never make any progression. And I think it's so important that, and again, we're talking about like progression, but if you went back to episode number 1 on your podcast, you probably are a different person now with the way that you present, for example. And if you could go back and see yourself, sorry, I'm sort of just thinking about things now, but the benefit of having something that is recorded and in the public means that you can go back and you can see that, and it almost allows you to acknowledge those wins. But you can't go back to your first ever sales pitch. It's not available. It's not available. So you don't know what your first ever sales pitch was like and how much you've come on.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? That is the kind of element of it's all archived and it's all available for us. I guess in the future we'll all have Neuralink or something that will be able to wind back and be like, oh, you said this in this particular environment, and you're able to watch it back. But yeah, that is a really good point. I'm a big believer in watching game tape as well. Oh, again, some of the young sales guys that I coached, 7 of them work in an auction house, and they record all their calls. And some of them are really diligent in listening back on a weekly basis to them and taking notes and sending them to me and sending them to their boss. And then some of them are really adverse to doing that. And the delta in the next 6 months between the ones that listen back to the game tape and take the feedback and the ones that don't is going to be ridiculous, both in terms of performance, but also in terms of how much they earn, because it's a heavily commission-based role. And I'm saying to them, the discomfort you experience now is going to be worth thousands of pounds to your bottom line. So sit in it for a little bit unless it's going to pay off.
Yeah. Is this something that you're doing with your
on the
full-time job on the side? So you're adding more things into your life, like
there's I've got bandwidth to do it.
Do you?
Yeah, definitely. Things that you do that feel like play to you that are work to others are your competitive advantage. I love conversations like this. I'm prepping for one that will happen tomorrow afternoon. I'm a big believer in. There's a lot coming at you here, Jay. I'm a big believer in bundling. I listen to podcasts while I'm doing other things. So on the tube over here, I was listening to a guest I'm interviewing tomorrow, and I was prepping and I was amending my notes. When I'm doing the washing up, I'm doing the same thing. When I'm walking in the morning, I'm doing the same thing. I'm listening and using the time available to me to tick off tasks that I know need to be done regardless. That's bundling. The second part, things that you're naturally good at, or you have an inclination for, or you've worked at and seen a level of mastery to, I can fit them in my calendar and not feel fatigued by them. We mentioned Sahil Bloom. He has an energy calendar concept where you grade things green, gives you energy, amber, mid, red, drains energy. I was in a presentation session this morning looking at our strategy for next year, and we were talking about particular things around product and stock and ordering. Red for me. I was like, oh God, I'm not enjoying this. I don't love this. Colin, can you do that Excel for us later to just fill out the quantities of sofas and desk chairs that were sold to this customer by month? I'm thinking, if I can outsource that, it's getting outsourced to one of the juniors in the team. But if it was, Colin, can you talk us through your process for approaching people on LinkedIn to get a first meeting or to get a referral down from C-suite down to operations? I'm like, yeah, brilliant. Let me show you this just now, and I'll show you this voice note, and I'll show you this template, and I'll write out the script for you to use because it's different for your sector. I'm energized by that. So the hour that I'm doing that doesn't feel like I've done any work. Very different, but everyone's wired differently. Finding those little things is key to living a life that doesn't feel like it's caving in on top of you.
Yeah. And I mean, everything that you've said there is, again, something that I can resonate with, because despite feeling like I've got no time to do the podcast, I love it so much that I don't feel like any of this time is negatively spent, whether it's the recording, the editing. I want to just create as much time as possible. And I guess this is going to lead into another question I have for you, but do you have a desire to go full time with the podcast? Because you have a full-time job. You're now doing sales training on the side. You have a podcast on the side as well. And if you look at a pie chart right now, in 5 years' time, how do you want that to be split?
A lot of people talk about, and this is a really good analogy, the whole Jordan Petersonism. When you have a goal to work towards, that's great. But when you have something to run away from, you'll push towards the goal faster. There's the whole, you put the rat in the box, you put the coil around its tail. We'll measure how hard it pulls when it pulls towards the cheese. Pretty fucking hard. It's hungry. We're going to waft the smell of a cat behind the rat, and it's going to have the cheese in front of it. It pulls much harder than the cat than the rat that's just got the cheese. I'm in a position where I actually really enjoy my sales role, and I enjoy the format of it. I enjoy the purpose it brings me. I enjoy the revenue that it brings me. I enjoy the process. So I'm not in a rush to run away from it towards podcasting or towards sales coaching full time. However, those are both higher, more noble purposes that I really enjoy doing. So there is an element of, I'd like to see the pie chart shift in that regard. In 5 years' time, I'm sure it will probably be closer to that. An element of realism I will give, and this is as somebody that's actually got a podcast masterclass. So I've helped probably 15, 16 shows launch their own podcast and really put it into a solid foundation. So that's a video course that's evergreen. It's not something that I have to spend a lot of time on as you're laughing there, Jay, in terms of you're taking on something else. No, that's evergreen resource that's available.
I'm actually laughing because you're just, I used the word earlier on, high functioning. Like that is the ambitious mind that I talk about in this, on the podcast title is sat in front of me right now.
Yeah, well, I try and embody that. But if I say I'm an ambitious mind, best believe I better fucking act like it.
Exactly,
okay?
Yeah.
So the podcast masterclass is there, and people have gone through it to create their own podcast. And I say this with that data, as well as being acquainted with people who run podcasts that are as big or a good bit bigger than mine. Being a full-time podcaster is a pipe dream for most people. Chris Williamson, Joe Rogan, Stephen Bartlett. There's very few who are doing it as the only thing, because those other people I mentioned all have other business interests and they have other revenue streams. Chris, for example, before moving out to the US in Austin, was running a nightclubs event business, had a property portfolio of student HMOs in Newcastle that many people don't know about, but I'm aware of due to interviewing him and becoming on good terms with him over time. Being just a podcast host is very unlikely. So to say, would you like to go full-time with the podcast? No, because I don't think it's possible for almost anyone bar a very select few. Would it be possible to sales coach 2 or 3 days a week and podcast 2 or 3 days a week? Yes. So that is potentially something you would want to aim towards and work towards. And that would be realistic, it would be purposeful, it would tick off boxes from a fiscal perspective, it would tick off boxes from an enjoyment perspective, it would tick off boxes from a freedom of location perspective, and we'll maybe talk about that in just a second. Those are like 4 or 3 or 4 currencies that you can assess things by. So I'm a big believer that, yes, my pie chart could shift, but would the pie chart ever be 100% podcasting? No, unless I consider myself to be the world's greatest podcaster, which I don't.
However, what the podcast, and I'm sure that you've discovered this over time, is that it becomes a very good lead generation tool for other parts of your life. For example, I can imagine that as you talk about sales on your podcast, it generates interest from guests, and they're likely, if you talk about it, to say, oh yeah, Colin's a good salesperson, he talks about being successful in his role, I'm more likely to listen to and take on his training as opposed to somebody else because they've
never heard of. Yeah, you're right.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, there's the whole it takes 7 hours of content for somebody to bridge the gap between never having heard of you and wanting to purchase your product or your service. How many Instagram reels do you need to create to be able to clock up 7 hours of 30-second clips? An awful lot. Whereas with a podcast, it's probably 7 episodes.
I hadn't known about that. And that
people give different figures, Jay. Let's be fair. People are like, oh, it's 16 hours or 18 touch points or whatever.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have been speaking recently about 7 hours, and that's something that I've heard.
Interesting. When you have a podcast that has an hour, exactly, it's not a lot, quite frankly. What are your personal and professional goals? So you speak about potentially wanting to do more of the sales training and do the podcast, but does it come from a financial freedom, and you use the word or not freedom of choice about where you want to live, etc. You know, what is it that
I brought this with me because it's a concept I learned about from Dr. Yusuf Smith, who was one of the early guests on Modern Wisdom, and he's been a guest on my show twice, and I'm a big fan of how Yusuf conducts himself. And he spoke about leaving the NHS as a junior doctor to go full-time with his online coaching business, Propane Fitness. And that did not come easily because he'd gone from being an investment banker to studying for medicine and all the time and energy that comes with. But he uses a model called the 4 currencies, and I mentioned 3 of them there. One of them is money. The second one's freedom of time. The third's freedom of location. And the fourth is satisfaction or purpose. And when I think about anything that I do, in terms of my day job just now as a sales director, the podcast, sales coaching, you need to consider how much of each of these are important to you. So if you were purely money driven, maybe I wouldn't work in selling furniture at all. Maybe I would work in selling software, or maybe I would work in selling pharmaceutical products. But would that align with my freedom of time, my freedom of location? Would it align with my purpose and my satisfaction? Maybe not. We don't know. But when you're considering all these different opportunities, you must consider which of these boxes are important to you. So, for example, if I was a sales coach full-time alongside the podcast, so let's say 80-20 split, I would need to consider, are all my workshops delivered online or are they delivered in person? Because that will have a direct impact on the currency of freedom of location. How much time a week do I think I would spend on this? Is it 40 hours or 50 hours like you do in your day job? Or is it less? Because that would free up more of your currency of freedom of time. If you create evergreen resources, so I mentioned the podcast masterclass, that's an evergreen resource. So there's no real time that's involved in that, apart from if I do a Black Friday offer where I discount it. There's a little bit of time me writing to my email list to talk about it or posting on socials, but that's there and ready. If I do the same with a sales masterclass with 50 modules based on sales mindset and prospecting and how to conduct a discovery meeting, how to conduct a pitch, how to follow up, that will be an evergreen resource which will not eat into my freedom of time, but would contribute towards money and freedom of location and purpose and satisfaction, because I get the feedback from people going through it and seeing results. So I always consider these different things when I'm thinking about what on earth it is that I want to spend my time doing.
You mentioned their freedom of location a few times. Do you see your future in the UK or do you see it somewhere else?
I live in a place called Bearsden, which is where I was born and raised. My family are from. My family raised me. I expect my mum and dad to continue to live there as well, and we're very close with them. We're 10 minutes walk from the house. My brother and I, we both live together in a flat really close to the family home. That's really important to me. I am concerned with the direction of travel the UK is going in, from a political perspective, from a safety perspective, from a fiscal perspective, and an environment perspective. I think it's never been worse. That gives me... it gives you that push. It gives you the cat behind you, maybe making you want to run away. Dubai has been a big temptation. I spent a lot of time there. I'm going again there in December. Maybe when this episode comes out, I'll be there just now. That's great from a tax perspective. It's great from a safety perspective. It's great from a weather perspective. There's other elements to it that are not perfect, but I'm sure if I lived there full time, I would come to understand those. And the grass is not always greener, but there is that temptation to have a freedom of location and have the income streams that would allow you to be based where you want to be when you want to be. I love where I live just now. I love the access I have to family, have to friends. A lot of my friends in the last 2 years, and actually in the next month, 2 of my closest friends, one's going to New York, one's going to Dubai. A lot of ambitious minds that we speak about are fleeing the UK. There's an element of, I feel, a responsibility to stay and try and make things better. And again, to make a political point, I do think the election of Trump and hopefully what that will mean for the UK moving forward politically will mean that we will see a shift away from what we're moving towards, which is this kind of globalist, corporatist, like all-controlling totalitarian centre, which really makes it hard for people who want to have autonomy and personal agency, and that is 2 of my highest values. That gives me the fear, and it makes me really unsettled, and I hope that politically we see a shockwave through the system and we see the likes of hopefully a sensible right of centre party come and challenge and become the government in the UK again and reverse some of the trends that we're going towards. That would make the UK considerably more attractive to stay in. But if I am building things that I'm really proud of and can lean on that would allow me to be location flexible, that would be a consideration, Jay. I can't lie.
Yeah, I had a fantastic guest on recently called David Bell, and he has always, he says his desire is to stay in the UK. However, he's currently looking to move to Portugal because he just feels like he's being pushed away. And he wants desperately to stay. He loves the UK. He wants to see the UK succeed. He wants to get the UK back to its sort of glory days.
MABA, make Britain great again.
Yeah, MABA. But Andrew Craig, who was on your podcast, spoke about this. And I work in the markets, like stocks and shares markets. So the analogy that he used was the FTSE 100. Now, on a global scale, the UK only makes up 4% of the global companies in that index. And 20 years ago, it was 11%. So it's becoming more and more insignificant. And what he wants to do is try to, he wants people to aspire to reverse that and go back towards the 11%. But, unfortunately, the UK has been for a while going in one direction. And then as young, ambitious people, when you see taxes going up, when you see, taxes not just from physical, like your actual taxes going up, but like income bands being frozen, for example, which is a bit of a stealth tax, and you say that I feel worse off right now, despite the fact that I'm earning more money. I feel like I'm making progress. And then you look at things like safety, and then you think about maybe I want a family in the future, and do I want my family to be here? And all of a sudden you write this like checklist of things, and I don't think that the UK right now is the place where I want to spend the next 5 to 10 years. And particularly with the new government that's in charge now, they are going to be there for 4 to 5 years. And do I see this trend reversing? Probably not. And it's a real dilemma because I'm the same as you. I wish that I didn't have to consider this. However, you then all of a sudden you start to say, the amount of tax I pay, am I getting value for money? And I think quite frankly right now, the answer is no. And we need to have a serious conversation in the UK about how do we give people that value for money. I personally don't believe it's necessarily like the Nordic countries where they take higher taxes, but then the social services are very high. I would prefer lower taxes. Personally.
I would like a smaller state.
Yeah, exactly. Of course.
Like they spend the money appallingly, so why should I give them more of it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this is why you mentioned Donald Trump, but Elon Musk has just
the efficiency.
Yes. Which is going to be
but he did
fantastic.
That. He did that with X. He walked in and he went, "What do you do?"
Yeah.
And if you can't explain it, and you can't show your KPIs and your metrics, then your salary is going to be really hard to justify. And our civil service is criminally bloated in the UK. I think I saw the other day there's something like 63,000 employees within the Ministry of Defence. And the UK's defence forces and our actual capabilities has shrunk to like a fraction of the size it's been previously. But the bureaucracy behind it has just grown and grown and grown. And I'm thinking, oh, well, I bet if somebody who was an entrepreneur and a really clued up business owner had a look at that, they would be horrified by the wastage.
Yeah, and also on that note, and this is one thing that really doesn't fill me with confidence, but in the UK, in government right now, there are barely any private sector workers. So, and that's in Keir Starmer's cabinet. So most people have come from either public sector roles before, or they've come from the private sector, but maybe in like a comms role, or they're working for one of them. She was a lawyer. However, she worked as a lawyer for a union. And it's like, are these the people that we want to be driving the country forward?
Driving off a cliff at the moment.
Well, yeah. And it's funny you mentioned about the public sector workers, because the NHS is the world's 7th largest employer. The UK only has 70 million people in it. I think less than that now. But the world's 7th largest employer, just behind like the Chinese military, the American military, and then like Walmart and Amazon. Like that's who you're.
Behemoths.
Yeah, behemoths, exactly. And then you've got the NHS, and we seem to be the NHS with a country attached, as opposed to a country with an NHS.
Yeah, it's a sacred cow. You can't really touch it, can you?
No.
And anyone that made moves to has been really heavily criticised and politically vilified. But I do think it would need like a Trump-like figure in the UK to take it off. And people talk about Farage, for example, and I think he has his merits, and he definitely has his downsides as well. But he's not got the gravitas of a Trump, and he's not got the rallying energy behind him, albeit he did really well with TikTok pre the election. And that is something that Trump leaned on with podcasts, with TikTok, with shorts. He gathered a lot of people who are politically disengaged, who were perhaps predisposed to get involved in the right sort of stuff, which is really important.
Interesting. We just had somebody walk into the room. Colin, one final question before we finish up. Is there something that you need to do in life to look back and say that that's been a success?
Success is something that I think's hard to define, but also easy in some other ways. And by that, I mean, it could be really specific, and you'd be like, oh, I want to make this amount of money, or I want to have this number of children, or I want to impact this number of lives through coaching or training or through a podcast, or I want to build this company that does this particular product or service that helps the world. Or you could be broader, which I feel that I'm able to do, and say that I did things that I felt I wanted to do with the people I wanted to do it with, in a way that aligned with my values and the energies that I had, and that I acted as a rising tide for the ships that I wanted to help rise with me. And I didn't break my moral code, or I didn't act out of alignment with my values, and I gave my all and had a good time while doing it. I think that's a far easier way to measure success, rather than sometimes we can be a little bit too binary and focused on one or two different metrics. And don't get me wrong, I think there's going to be goals that I set in the next year, 2 years, that are very clear for me to say, did I hit them? Did I work towards them in the right way? But more broadly, when it comes to success as a whole, in terms of me looking back at 90, 100 years old, however long that I managed to live to, then I want to look back and be very confident that I did the things that I said I was going to do in the way that I said I wanted to do them, with the people that I wanted to do them with, in a way that I can reflect upon that I said that was fantastic. Whether that is selling lots more furniture, or having a wonderful wife and 2 little boys, or whether that's something else entirely, I want to make sure that I live in alignment with those values that I set out as my core fundamentals, and I live those for...
Yeah, and you are doing those things now, which is full credit to you, because you are providing that platform to inspire other people, which is amazing. And when you think about it, you mentioned at the start that you're 32 years old. You're still so young, and you're already doing this. And I just think that over time, how this can compound over the next, some people would say, if you had a traditional career, you've got 35 years left of doing this. Like, it's actually insane when you think about it, the level of progress that you've made today. and how this can exponentially grow in the future and hopefully impact so many people, millions of people. I'm sure you're already impacting millions of people. I don't know. How many downloads do you know that you've had?
Yeah, YouTube's got something like 800k, and then audio's a little bit less than that, maybe like 700, something like that.
Is that right? So your YouTube has generated,
but YouTube includes shorts, so it's hard. It's really hard to measure what the full podcasts have.
Yeah.
Which kind of is a bit of a cheat from that regard. But that's the only way you can break down the channel. But yeah, many people listening, and again, all that feedback that people give you is amazing, and it just feels like you're pulling in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna finish off by saying, where can people find you?
LinkedIn is where we connected, so that's Colin T. Campbell. Instagram is col.cambro, which is CAMBRO. And the podcast, wherever you're listening to this, you can find CamBro Conversations. And I would love to hear from you, and I hope you've all enjoyed this conversation as much as I have.